Hinduism is dead, and godless pagans pray to nothing. Similarly, in a world without chatbots, you see a world in which extremities rise. You see a world in which people are unable to access the deep spiritual benefits that religion comes forth, and you are unable to give a century-long group of oppressed people the recourse they deserve. A few points of setup and 3 main pushes. First point of setup. What would these chatbots likely to look like? We think obviously in terms of practicalities they could work in a similar mannerism to ChatGPT, other chatbots, etc. Crucially, however, we think that on the whole, these chatbots are going to be very moderate. They're not going to be extreme. They're not going to tell you that as a Muslim you should be doing things such as engaging in jihadi activity, etc. Why is this true? Firstly, notice what AI is reliant upon. The way that AI works is that it is generative. That is, it is reliant upon taking millions and millions of different pieces of text before figuring out what was the most likely outcome to a result as a combination of said text. So using your using your brain intuitively, given that there's a huge amount of text and the vast majority of text is obviously going to be not extreme, the vast majority of text is likely to be moderate, it means that it's very, very likely for ChatGPT, for these sorts of AI chatbots to then spout said minority views. Not minority views, right? What was it? These okay, right. But secondly, realize that even if they do decide to say these sorts of extreme views, we think that that's obviously likely to be very unlikely for 2 reasons. Firstly, obviously as a member or someone creating those chatbots, you want it to be successful. That is to say that the vast majority of people accessing those chatbots probably don't want to be told really extremist views. But then secondly, there are already mechanisms of recourse to prevent people from accessing extremist views. That is to say, I can't just hop on Google and get instructions on how to make meth. I have to do things such as go on the dark web, interact with really weird torrenting sites, etc. The vast majority of people don't have the ability to do that. So that's why these sorts of chatbots are likely to be non-extreme, etc. Secondly, who are the types of people who are going to access this? We think there are 2 important groups here. Firstly, people who are either unable to access a pastor, etc. That is, people who are already religious. They just want to be able to get advice throughout the day. Secondly, people who are associated or culturally interested in that religion. That is to say that I am ethnically Iraqi. I have a deep tie to Islam, but I'm not Muslim myself. That is, I still want to be able to learn more about my culture, etc. Okay, then thirdly on accuracy. Why can't negative just stand up and say this is going to be inaccurate, this is going to mislead people, etc.? Because all religion is in and of itself inaccurate. That is to say that all religions rely upon some idea of the word of God being translated by man. That is, all of us understand that it is an interpretation that is subject and willing to change. Okay, 3 main pushes. Firstly, why is religion in and of itself good? Secondly, then why religion is likely to be more propagated, and thirdly, why religion is better, more likely to be better. Firstly, why is religion in and of itself a good thing? 2 pushes both on society and on an individual. Firstly, on society, because religion tells you that to be a good person is to engage within your community, that it is to do things such as donate to charity, that it is to do things such as engage within the people around you and make sure that you have social cohesion, etc. On the ground, this looks like things such as the Red Cross, or rather the Salvation Army, right? Doing things such as activist groups, etc., working to help people because they are Christian, because Christianity tells them that this is what a good person ought to do. But secondly, it also gives you a renewed sense of community. That is to say that religion is more than just what the Bible tells you. It is going to the church every Sunday. It is being able to interact with people who believe the same things as you. It is trying to be kind to one another. That then leads to individually why it's likely to be very good for you. Firstly, it gives you a sense of purpose. It tells you that you don't have to be nihilistic, that your life isn't futile, that your life can exist around making meaningful connections with other people, around the Word of God, etc. That is obviously very, very good. But okay, look, let's take religion at its very, very worst case. That is the worst case in which religion tells you that you own slaves, it says that you stone queer people, it says that you kill infidels, etc. Why should you ought to weigh this out of this debate or not consider it? The reason why you don't consider this in this debate, for a few reasons, is as follows. The people who are engaging those sorts of actions are likely to be already extreme. That is to say that accessing those chatbots aren't going to make suddenly a huge amount of new terrorists. Isn't going to make a new group of people suddenly want to stone homosexual people. But then secondly, we already characterized and set up how this was likely to be moderate. And then thirdly, notice how what they need to do in this debate, right, is show you how there was somebody who was never going to be extreme in the first place, suddenly become extreme. To that extent, even if religion did say those things in the first place, as long as we can prove that their religion is likely to improve as a direct result, it is a worse religion on their side versus a better religion on ours. Okay, secondly then, why is religion likely to become more prevalent, etc.? This is intuitively true for a few reasons. Firstly, because its barriers of entry are far reduced. That is to say, I don't need to go to a church, I don't need to like meet new people, I don't have to like sort of stomach up the nerve to go and like go to a mosque for the first time to access spiritual advice. I can do that through ChatGPT, etc., and work my way up. But then secondly, even if you were religious to begin with, it allows you to access it at a scale that you never were able to before. That is to say that going to like, you don't have 24/7 access to a pastor, to a rabbi, etc. Now you do. But like crucially, what is important to note here, this doesn't replace religion, it supplements it. That is to say that the reason why people like religion in the first place is because there is a human touch associated with it. It's because I can access a community. Insofar as to say that this debate then is no longer, I'm going to like go to ChatGPT instead of a pastor, that's probably not going to happen for a few reasons. Firstly, because people still want to be able to go to a pastor because of the community ties. People still want to be able to talk to other people because, hello guys, sometimes it's not fun staring at a computer screen all day. Okay, great. Thirdly then, why is religion far likely to be better? Okay. Note how changing religion as a whole was never a bad thing. That means negative can't stand up here and say, you're changing like the word of God, etc. That's likely to make people, like that's likely to encourage backlash, so on and so forth. Why is this true? Because I've like highlighted this before, all religion is interpretive. That is to say that like God says some word, man writes it down in the Bible, insofar to say that every single pastor on earth says that the word of Bible was an interpretation of God, it wasn't necessarily what God believed, it was open to some interpretation. On the grounds, it's fairly intuitive, right? Like Pope Benedict was like deeply homophobic, etc. Like obviously, like he engaged in several actions which like really detrimental like the queer community, etc. You see like the new Pope Francis engage in extraordinarily queer accepting methods, saying that like to be queer is fine in the Catholic Church, and to say that we ought to accept and like we also like accept these sorts of individuals, etc. And to say that even if the very head of a religious organization can backflip like that, is like to the extent where we say religion is obviously very capable of change. Okay, so why was religion likely to change for the better? Firstly, chatbots are far more likely to be moderate than an individual. Why is this true? This is true because A, it is generated based on like a vast majority of text. That is to say that you have more moderate text than you have extreme text. So extreme text were likely to get drowned out. But then secondly, even if it was going to be extreme, there was like government recourse to prevent that from happening. That is to say, as a government, you probably have an active incentive to not have homophobic messaging being spread out. It means that you can, like, at its very worst, like literally block people from accessing those websites in the first place. We think that is like pretty true insofar as to say that like governments don't allow you to access dangerous information. We think there was a precedent to do that in the first place. So what does that mean? It means that if I'm going to be accessing religious content at a scale far greater than I was before, when that religious content is likely to be more moderate, it means that I myself am likely to be more moderate. What does that mean then in terms of like queer communities, etc.? It means that on the long term, in the long scale, you see like religious communities that are likely to be far more accepting of minority individuals. It means that I as a minority individual, crucially, am now able to gain access to that spiritual benefit that religion gave. Notice how I was locked out of that to begin with, now I am. This is analogous to like, for instance, from like people engaging in slavery and now being able to access all those like benefits of a system they were never able to access in the first place, because now those benefits of religion, etc. are open to them. We get more religion, we get better religion. I'm incredibly proud to propose. Thank you. Woo!
I think the opposition misunderstands how this debate actually plays out, because the reality is that these religions aren't all of a sudden going under and going to disappear into the void. They're obviously still going to exist to a significant extent. However, as we're going to prove throughout the speech, it is likely that it'll be far more radical, that will be far worse quality in terms of the advice given to people, and ultimately we think that people are going to use this to justify bad behaviours based on religion. We're going to do a couple things in the speech. Firstly, a few points of setup, then explaining why this necessarily creates bad advice, then why people use it poorly, and then finally how this has a set of religious harms for adherents. So firstly, in terms of setup, I'm going to do a couple things here. Firstly, establishing who actually create these chats. And likely we think it's not going to be institutions themselves, like it's not going to be the Catholic Church. This is because often it's simply replacing them. Like the priests in the Catholic Church don't want to be replaced, they're not going to support this. But as well as that, they're simply not in touch with technology a lot of the time. These are quite ancient institutions, so it's unlikely it's going to be them. Instead, we think it's far more likely to be radical people. This is for the reason that they often care a lot about spreading the faith and like creating more adherence. And at that point, they'll likely create something that is very easy to spread, that is very capable of spreading their faith to other people, and that looks like a chatbot that you can easily send people with a link. Furthermore, then secondly, I'm going to explain how these chatbots actually work. As I say, it is generative. It is created on a trained data set of text, and often it needs lots of it. This looks like religious books and other things, but notably, it is controlled by the creator as to what is within the data set. So on that, I'm going to now get into the first issue in this debate. That is firstly about the bad advice and whether the quality of this advice. And firstly, I'm going to explain why it is far more likely it's going to be radical advice than moderate advice. And this is for 3 reasons. Firstly, we think, as we establish and set up, it is likely the creator is far more radical than a moderate, and as a result, this person is going to feed them radical data. It is going to be data that they agree with, and when that data set is then based on a bunch of radical texts and radical beliefs, it is likely then that it will result in being a radical chatbot that will suggest radical ideas. We think this necessarily has the harms of radical things, like extreme homophobia and racism and other things like that. Secondly, we think that the radical texts are simply overrepresented in the data, and this is simply for the reason that radical people care far more about their faith, they're far more active adherents, and as a result, they're far more likely to publish things. This looks like the fact that the most radical and extremist Jewish people are the ones that dictate and make the most text and most understanding of Jewish understanding of the Jewish faith. But then furthermore, we simply think that in sacred texts themselves, there are often radical ideas, such as the fact that if you read the Bible word for word, you would think it was like a piece of hate speech. But ultimately, lots of this is discounted by adherents in the modern world. But ultimately, the bot is unable to do this sort of nuanced analysis of text. But a priest is able to. A priest is able to do that understanding, to understand that times have changed and that we change what we believe in. This is not something a bot can do. A bot doesn't have the discretion to understand that change. But furthermore, thirdly, we think it's simply seen as objective when this radical stuff happens. So you don't realize that the bot has become radical because it simply is a robot that is seemingly creating like the almighty, where the opposite thinks is like the almighty word of God. But now secondly, I'm going to talk about why, even if it's not more radical beliefs, it's likely to simply be worse quality advice. And this is for the reason that it simply can't comprehend emotions, it can't understand the needs of the adherent and what is going on. Secondly, we think it simply has less understanding of the situation. This looks like the fact that you can't simply describe your entire situation. Noting here that priests often knew you since you grew up. They're likely your local priest or rabbi. And ultimately, a chatbot is unable to understand that kind of situation with your 10-sentence and input into this Rabbi GPT. So ultimately then, we think it has a less understanding of the situation. But thirdly, we finally think that there is no nuance for different communities and the understanding of it. Noting here that your priest is within your community, understands those specific beliefs that you hold, and is therefore far more likely to tailor it towards you. So ultimately then, I'd like to establish another comparative as to how this exists in comparison to a priest or a community that would go to. Noting here that this matters a lot because the people that are going to these chatbots for advice probably do need real advice because they are literally going to a chatbot for it. So now in terms of why the priests are actually far better. This is the reason they are far less radical and they have a far greater understanding of the person. This is also the fact that they have a reputation to uphold, so they can't hold the most radical beliefs. Secondly, they rely on the community, so they can't stretch their beliefs and what they say too far from what that community actually believes in. They also can't bend too far away from what the actual institution believes in. And thirdly, we simply think that priests understand the nuance of how these religions have changed over time. They understand that being homophobic is probably not the best thing in the modern world, and therefore are far more less likely to engage in those practices when giving advice. So at the end of that, we think it's far more likely that we're going to get high quality advice. I'd like to put now secondly, on how people use this advice poorly, particularly. We think this is the fact that it is fairly easy to use bots to justify your actions. And this is the fact that when you're only using this as confirmation, not necessarily to find actual religious truths. This looks like someone that is radical and wants to justify being homophobic towards someone, want to go into this chatbot, creating a really tricky wording that will twist the words in a way that the chatbot will give a specific answer, and then they can use that to say, oh, it is being justified by this religious bot. They're simply using it for justification. This can't exist in the world where you have a priest, because obviously you can't twist words in a way that tricks a robot. It is far less likely that it's going to trick an actual person, but as well as that, you probably aren't able to do it in a way, it is far more embarrassing to do it when you are going to a priest and you have that reputational impact that happens when you do ask questions like this. So at the end of that, it's quite clear that people are going to be able to use this for particularly bad ways, and in ways that can justify particularly bad actions, such as say homophobia or racism towards particular groups. But now finally, I'd like to establish how this has simply just has a set of religious harms. And this looks like the fact that you feel as though you have transgressed your faith when you find out that this chatbot doesn't actually represent your faith because it is a robot. The opposition's response here is simply to say that it doesn't matter because all faith is understood to be interpreted and possibly incorrect. But yes, that it was interpreted by people, not a robot. It is obviously likely to be understood this robot doesn't actually represent the faith. It is far more likely likely to be seen as something that is kind of blasphemous at the end of the day. So ultimately, while yes, people understand that it is interpreted by people. People can interpret the word of God, robots can't. Secondly, we think you don't have to interpret this religion yourself anymore. This ultimately means you get less spiritual fulfillment from actually engaging with this religion. So ultimately, at the end of that, you simply have a set of harms to these people who are religious, who are adherents, who feel that they've been less engaged with their faith, they feel as though they have gone against their faith, and we think there's a huge harms to those individuals. So ultimately, at the end of that substantive portion of this speech, you should believe this advice is going to be far more radical than a priest. It's going to have far less quality and less relation to the individual themselves than a priest or a rabbi would. Furthermore, we think people are going to use this to justify particularly poor actions, and then furthermore, it's simply going to have a set of religious harms. But now I'm going to respond to the opposition's main push here, which is that religions are just good because community and charity and things like that. But ultimately, the bot can't substitute these things. It's not the tipping point at which you can have a community or you can have a charity. Noting here that any time in which you have a charity, it is probably likely that you also have a real priest or church that you could go to. It is unlikely that your ability to form a charity or for the Salvation Army to exist, like that does exist, and it's probably exists because we have real priests. If you have an entire town that can only use a chatbot, they're probably not going to have the best community, and they're probably not going to have the best charity. It's not the tipping point for this sort of change. So ultimately, at the end of this, it's quite clear that all the benefits about this community and charity that come from having religions kind of fall through at the point where the bot doesn't actually create these. As they said themselves, it only supplements religion, but it doesn't actually do that to a significant extent that it, like at the very least, there's only a marginal change in terms of the amount of community and the amount of charity that the opposition is able to achieve. So the opposition is simply unable to win on this at the point where you realize that the quality of this advice is particularly poor, that people are going to use this to justify bad things. Because even if, because they can only get such a small benefit from having this extra community and charity because we have a 24/7 priest rather than one that exists during all of the waking hours. Ultimately, at the end of this, the opposition's main push falls through, and you should clearly vote for the affirmative page. Thank you.
When affirmative tell you, so when they tell you that robots can't interpret the word of God and it'd be seen as blasphemous for them to do so, it probably clashes pretty strongly with their material that the most conservative members of these groups, religious groups, are going to be the ones coming up with these chatbots. The most conservative ones are going to be the ones proselytizing on the internet through, religious version of ChatGPT or whatever. So, a few things in this speech. Firstly, reiterating why we think it's more likely that these will be supplementary, not replacing religion, material that they couldn't decide whether or not they accepted. Secondly, why we're going to get more moderate chatbots. And then thirdly, why this is a really good thing for religion as a whole long term and what that means for society with more religion. So firstly, why is it more likely to be supplementary? We just don't think people are going to see, oh, the thing that I type in questions into on Google is the one, that's going to be the moral arbiter of truth. People fundamentally understand religion as a community experience, as a human experience. It's something, you go to church every Sunday, right? It's something that you do in a group of people, with people in a location. The chatbot simply does not have that. People do not, are very unlikely to replace their whole religion and their whole community with chatbots. Secondly, we think that people just inherently have some innate questioning of chatbots and there's a level of understanding that this is not a human. People know that ChatGPT isn't actually the arbiter of truth. They're probably going to know the same things about all these religious chatbots. So, secondly, why are these chatbots going to be moderate and not extreme? What does the negative tell us here? They tell us that these chatbots are going to be made by the most conservative people who want to proselytize the most, and that the text space they're drawing from is going to be significantly biased towards conservative, regressive texts. Why is this not the case? Well, firstly, what I told you just before, right? What the next own material is that these having technology being involved in religion is a pretty progressive take, a pretty radical progressive take. We think you're dealing with more progressive people in the religion who are willing to do that. Secondly, they tell you that people in religions are less, religious institutions are not going to do it because they're less technically literate. But what we are thinking is the opposite, that kind of mainstream religious institutions have a structural incentive to create this kind of thing because it provides more access to the religion, which is the entire point of the institution of the church, to provide access to religion, right? We think that if they probably see these kinds of things as exactly within their priorities. And thirdly, then we have all the stuff that we brought you at first, that like there are limits in law, there are limits in terms of public perceptions of these things, which are like, you know, what is acceptable, and the most extreme positions are simply not. So we think it's, you know, will not be like acceptable publicly in terms of image of the religion, will not be accepted like by law, by governments, you know, which will like, you know, restrict access to these sites and that kind of thing. So we think that at that point, it's very reasonable to suggest that at the very least, the creators of these chatbots will not be able to institute an implicit conservative bias. But why are the set of texts we're using not going to also be biased towards conservatism? So firstly, like, we have no evidence from side negative as to why we shouldn't necessarily believe that, like, if you take the average of all religious texts, they're more conservative than they are progressive, right? Like, we think that for every, you know, like, right-wing radical, there's, you know, every Pope Benedict, there's a John Shelby Spong or something saying that actually the opposite should be true, that you should take the most liberal stance on queer people, on divorcees, similar things, or like just people with disabilities. We think these are things that are like, that you have probably similar to your split in society, that like roughly reflects your split in religion, because religion has like historically been a society-wide thing. But secondly, we think that like, the other push they have here is that original texts are like fundamentally like regressive, and we just don't think this is the case, or we don't think it's significant. Firstly, it's not significant because like, you know, your copy of the Bible that's in your Christian ChatGPT is one text against 1,000 texts of analysis. But secondly, we think that like just as many passages as there are in these texts that are like, oh, you know what, it's actually, you know, you should not be queer, or, you know, might actively promote homophobia. There are also, you know, the classic, the most important commandment is to love your neighbor, you know, above all else. That kind of thing exists in all these texts fairly universally across most major religions. So we think that like this claim that the original texts are going to bias towards conservatism, so once again, just doesn't hold. So, where are we left so far? What we have proven is that these chatbots are going to be fundamentally supplementary to our role. That is to say, the institution of religion still exists. You still go to church. You still want to go to like church or synagogue or the mosque or whatever. And secondly, that these chatbots are going to be fundamentally moderate. What's the effect of these chatbots being so moderate? Sorry, one more point on moderates. We hear from a negative that your priests are more likely to be moderate than your chatbots are. So firstly, we've shown that the chatbots are going to be like very moderate at least, if not like actively progressive, given that you're dealing with the most progressive people that are like willing to say that this is an appropriate use of like religion. But even if we look at like the, you know, the priest body that we're comparing it to, we don't accept a negative characterization that all priests are just like moderate because they're average, right? Whether a priest is moderate or radical depends entirely on the community that they're in. You're dealing with a more radical community, you get a more radical priest. We think in these kinds of places where you have the most radical priests, that will probably have the most significant benefit on our side of the house, because we're able to tell you that like people who are in these radical communities who are being like oppressed by the dogma that they have to deal with are able to go to these chatbots and find an alternative view on religion that isn't available in their community, a significantly more moderate view. That's a really significant benefit in the, on our side of the house. So, what's the effect of having this more moderate thing? So the effect of having this more moderate thing in terms of like queer community and minorities, we have people who are particularly affected over long term in the like history of religious institutions of having particular harms suffered by them, who are now able to like identify themselves with the kind of mainstream position of the church, that's like the most easily accessible position of the church that is available online. In addition to that, we have like massive benefits in terms of access. That we brought to you at first, where you get a whole lot of people who like previously were unable to get access to religious guidance or unable to get sufficient access to religious guidance, suddenly significantly more able to. And we know that even if like negative can claim that this advice will be used badly or will be used to justify bad things, we think that like, you know, the average homophobe in a religion is probably just as capable of finding a way to twist the words of a a chatbot as they are to twist the words of the original, like the Bible itself, or to twist the words of any one of a number of very very significant contributions to the scholarly work around and theological religion. So, at this point in the debate, we've shown you that these chatbots are going to be significant, they're not only going to be moderate themselves, they're going to be moderating influences on the religions themselves. This is when we got more people with more access to religion and a better religion, we were so proud to propose.
It seems intuitive that there would be like a spectrum of chatbots in this debate, and the opposition view these chatbots as basically just sort of an extension of the already existing mainstream hegemonic religious institutions, right? Like the Catholic Church will put out the Catholic Church chatbot, or the Ulam will put out its chatbot. But in that scenario, it's very unclear what their benefit is, because they never explain why it specifically needs to be a chatbot, as opposed to sort of already existing very widespread network of religious infrastructure that these places do. Because if you are a Catholic, in any area where there are Catholics, you obviously do have access to a church. You obviously have access to a Bible. You obviously have access to the other sort of information that they put out, and they never defend the specificity of it needing to be a chatbot. But the scenario that we tell you is the sort of bigger impact one in this debate, and the one where the chatbots are more likely to be a tipping point or a change in watershed moment in how religious works, are the type of sort of happy clappers, extreme spiritualist Mormons who don't have as much spread in the existing world, so they're the ones who are most likely to index into the chatbots and to and use them. But that is also secondly the case where people are most likely going to use the chatbot, because in the scenario where you do have access to both a mainstream religious institution and the chatbot, you probably would go to the mainstream religious institution for all of the reasons they point to, which is the fact that the people value the sort of community of religion and all those sorts of things. But firstly, let's take them at their absolute best and explain and assume that these chatbots do work very well and do simply sort of reflect whatever ideal religious views they want to claim. Their first claim then is that the chatbots are sort of the necessary pillar to the continuing of good religion and people accessing religion. The first and sort of obvious and probably worst claim here is just maybe some secular but curious people will become interested in religion. Obviously very unclear why they would go to a religious chatbot in the first place, or secondly be converted to it by the instance in their ears. Their sort of better claim here as well, there may be some people who want to keep in touch with religion but find it difficult to access the sort of religious authority. But they don't explain why this is a particular impact. Because if you're already so disinvested in religion that you have one foot out the door, then it is unclear why you maintaining a close connection to that religion is such a big harm in this debate. Because it's unlikely to be that sort of psychologically damaging to you. It's unlikely for you to feel any sort of guilt about that. And in the scenario where people did particularly want to stay invested in the religion, they can take that action. But thirdly, in their absolute best case instance, where it's just there's one person who is just too far away from any church or any mosque or any sorts of things, they can still use it in our world. I would note the topic is just supporting the rise of these chatbots. So these chatbots may still exist in our world. This debate is about whether they should be mainstream or not. So the very extreme outlier case that they want to talk about is not particularly harmful. But even if you don't buy that response, we can still just much rather interpret this person, do their own interpretive part with their own religious text for reasons I'll explain later. But secondly, let's continue to assume that these bots are very good, they're made the best intentions by the most well-intentioned religious leaders. Why would we just prefer that people go to a priest? I would note the framing for this is it's not the sort of religious education that they want to talk about. In that case, it is just a glorified Google for religion. Those are the sorts of things that we're happy to support under our side. The specific and unique aspect of a chatbot is the fact that you can hold a conversation with it, which normally takes the form of asking it some sort of questions. And as we explained to you, a lot of the time this will be when people need advice and feel like they can't reach out to anyone else. We'd much rather they reach out to a priest. We'll give you a bunch of reasons why religious leaders have incentives to do this well, they care about their community, they have reputational incentives. But I'd also point out they are just human. They can provide you with advice with empathy. They can understand your emotions when you talk to them in a way that a chatbot simply cannot, because it is not human. But secondly, they also do have community connections, because often religion is very integrated with, for example, family or other sorts of things, and we'd say people would also be likely to sort of reach out to their family or other sorts of spiritual leaders in their community who aren't necessarily part of religious institutions. which means they have the capacity to talk to people, which means they have the capacity to tailor their advice and their thoughts to particularly your situation, which I point out that chatbots are unable to do because there's probably just like one chatbot for the main religion, and put you in type of touch with the type of people who will help you, the type of programs that you need. And all of this analysis applies to even the absolute most generous conception of these bots, and I think that explains why they're very far behind in this debate. But let us deal with why that is extremely unlikely to be the characterization of these bots that is ought to be dealt with in this debate. We have given you a bunch of very good analysis that has largely gone unresponded to. Their first claim here, what do they say though? They firstly say, well, you know, it's going to be moderate because if you just sort of feed it all the data, it will average out. Obviously that is contingent on who is feeding it the data, and obviously we tell you that person can make choices about what type of data they feed it, which means in that sort of worst case scenario, if it is someone who's particularly radical, that is still obviously going to feed it data with a radical tilt. But it's not just about it being radical, because the fact is, regardless of who is making it, that means someone's perspective is built into the bot, which means someone's perspective is becoming very widespread and is becoming, that is very harmful. But secondly, if you do just feed it out the data, it's not like you average out like a very radical take and a very moderate one, and you just end up with like a golden ratio in the middle of just like correct and perfect religious views. In fact, you're probably just likely, if you tell to bot to like average out two different strains of the religion, you just created a set of advice that no one can agree with. That is obviously very harmed. But thirdly, we tell you that these bots just lack the ability to be nuanced. They simply for example, it'll be like confuse them to disentangle contradicting pieces of data. All this is to explain that in the worst case scenario for them, where someone is making the bot with an agenda, is very good. And it's very difficult to tell whether that is a scenario. Firstly, because the bot always appears objective, and because the data models behind these bots are proprietary, so they will not be revealed. But it's also just secondly very difficult for someone who isn't super educated in the religion, or who isn't super educated in the way these chatbots work, to make that sort of critique, which means it is very likely that these chatbots are sort of radical. And no, this doesn't need to be like every chatbot is like this. Our burden here is simply to prove that one of them is particularly bad, and in that one instance, the comparative between the radical chatbot and the regular sort of religious advice is much more dramatic than the comparative between that they deal in their side. So, what are the impacts of this? First of all, we do just tell you that people get worse advice. They get advice which is more radical or is simply contradictory to their religion. That is obviously a massive harm, because it means that when a young girl who is brought up in a Christian family finds herself pregnant and feels too scared to talk to her parents, that bot will give her bad advice. It will give her advice that either doesn't contradict with her religion, and she will not take the take the time to interpret and balance her own needs, her own priorities, her own situation, which the bot cannot understand, and her own connection to her religion to decide what she ought to do. That is obviously something that is deeply personal and is something that is much better than a particular agenda pushed by a bot en masse. But this just explains that people get generally bad advice in general. It's deeply spiritually and psychologically harmful to them. But secondly, this is also a massive harm to their connection with their religion, because it does mean that the advice that these bots are giving you do not match people's A, own personal understanding of the religion, or B, the sort of doctrinal, institutional understanding of their religion. That means that when people realize this dissonance, they feel like they have transgressed, they feel like they have gone against what their local community leader would have told them, which is a person they look up to. That is obviously something that is deeply traumatic for them. Their only claim here and their only response here is to say, but all religion is interpretive. Obviously, first of all, if you talk to a religious person and you try and tell that to them, they will deny that, and they will absolutely tell you that they are listening to the word of God, they are listening to the religion as it once was. But secondly, even in the scenario where religion was interpreted, both the acts of personal interpretation are very important to it. For example, if you're a Protestant, how you interpret the Bible is meaningful. Or there is a set of religious people and religious figures who are have some sort of divine authority to do that interpretation, like the Dalai Lama. That is obviously something that the chatbot is not doing. That is deeply harmful to the sort of spiritual practice of religion. This bot gives people bad advice. This bot cannot be human. Very, very proud to engage.
Some of that
speech, I thought that both teams think that religiosity will increase, but where the difference is in this debate is whether or not it would be extremist or moderate chatbots. But I think the debate got a little bit messy at the point at which they asked the question, well, what's the benefit of actually it needing to be a chatbot? This wasn't explained. I think this was explained, but I think what was more interesting is a little bit of a shift in priority here, where they realized that it was kind of intuitive that these chatbots were not probably likely to be like these extremist groups, but rather were likely to kind of just be like these moderate kind of devices. But I think the second thing to note here is it's a little bit of a tension when they can claim that both like these religious chatbots are not going to produce like a significant enough change, but also it's going to result in like a lot of extremist views. Next final thing that I want to respond to this is I think we did explain why it specifically needed to be a chatbot. And I think that analysis should kind of be redacted from this debate. So I think the first thing on like who will access this chatbot, it's like people who are unable to access it in the first place, or it's like very hard to access it in the first place. It gives us the argument that, look, oh yeah, we have like churches in every single like kind of neighborhood, but I think like Christianity isn't the only religion. I think there's like a lot of religions that don't have very accessible like institutions. Like for instance, like where I live, there's like a very, very big Indian population, and the nearest temple is like 40 like kilometers away. I think to the point where that exists, to the point where there are more fringe religions, I think that it's like very needed for something to be like way more accessible. Secondly, people who are unwilling to access. Thirdly, people who are extrinsically religious, and what they'll do to engage with this chatbot is like, oh, it's a very easy way for me to engage with my religion, to fulfill my extrinsic message. They learn a little bit more, and as we told you down the bench, that was the trigger for them to learn more about their religion, to start to convert that extrinsic religiosity into intrinsic religiosity. It was the delta to become happier. It was the delta to have the opportunity to become happier, because it was something that was far more accessible than the people that they were talking about there. Cool, let's talk about the idea that I think both teams generally agree that there will be an increase in religiosity to some extent, but I think where you want to judge this debate is whether you think that this is going to be positive or negative religiosity. So, is it going to be extremists who make these chatbots, which creates like a homophobic pipeline, or is it going to be an accessible kind of moderate tool that like, because literally it has an incentive to maximize usage? I think it's pretty intuitive that it's going to be the latter, but I'm going to kind of structurally explain this by walking through the intuition of the op team and then explaining to you the mechanisms and responses we've had down the bench. Because I think it's just been a very unintuitive case from the opposition team to just be like, oh, it's going to be like run by extremists and it's going to have extreme views. I think the claims that we make are a little bit more rational here, but let's kind of delve into this debate. So in terms of like the idea of like radical people are going to be making chatbots, there are two assumptions that we get from assertions that we get from opposition here. The first is that, okay, just because the church isn't going to make it, it's going to be like extremist. But then they realize that this is a little bit weird, and they're like, oh, someone's opinion is going to go into this chat box. And then they say that, okay, GitaGPT, like Rabbi, Ask Rabbi, whatever, all of these are going to like not be made by moderates. It's going to be made by extremists. I think that this is untrue at the point at which you at the point at which empirically, the point you ask like GitaGPT, or you ask these like chatbots, or even if you ask like ChatGPT what like their views on homosexuality is, like they literally respond with, it is like good to respect everyone equally. I think like the reason why they have those inbuilt messages to sensitive topics is precisely because they want to increase usage. They want to make it something that's appealing, because that's the entire point. I think what opposition fails to do in this debate is give you a thorough enough mechanization of why it's likely to be like extremist people. We gave you two big characteristics. One is there's a very clear incentive in the sense that these people want to increase usage. There's nothing more, there's nothing less. They want to increase usage of these websites. To that extent, it was far more practical and far more likely for, as we empirically see now, things like GitaGPT, things like Ask Rabbi, being moderate. Like currently in the status quo, this is empirically true. And we are the only team in this debate that has given you a substantial enough metric, and we've given you some reasonability to believe why it's going to be moderate. And if that's not the case, then it's just empirical anyway. But the second thing that we give you is like the idea of like a mindset. So like, what is the mindset of people going in to make a GPT? The fundamental, I think it's a very interesting time, and it's a very weird debate because it's like GPTs and it's like new and all that, but I think like people who make GPTs go in there and they look at GPT as an objective metric. They that is something that is intrinsically detached from the idea of like very hyper-specified opinions. And I think at the point at which you realize, and this is what Robert tells you, is the idea that extremist views is innately and intrinsically connected to the ideas of opinions. At the point at which you have an organization that is likely to be like very like factual and very objective and likely to also want to maximize access, you then had to believe, based on reasonability, that we were more likely to be correct in saying that it was going to be more moderate views that was going to be exposed. If you believe that, then yeah, all of the benefits we give you in Leo stand. All the benefits about people getting a trigger to actually become and engage in more physical aspects of religiosity stand. Don't let them get away with the idea that you need like a pastor in order to like become religious. You can kind of like understand more objective opinions about kind of like Christianity and all of the like doctrines and ideas within it, and that can ignite a spark within you to actually go to a church. That can make you more passionate. That can give you the opportunity to lead a happier and more fulfilling life. Next thing that they tell you is that, okay, let's say that even if it is objective, well, in objective, like religious texts, there's going to be extremist views. There's likely to be like homophobia maybe in the Bible, because people can game these things. People can like make it say what they want it to say. The first response that we have to this is that the people who are going to game this and make it say what they want to say are probably going to only post this into like very extremist like groups, which is going to create a minimum delta anyway, because those people are likely going to do something similar already. The real big change that we see here is the people who are unable to access religious like institutions, the people who had temples like 40 kilometers away from them, but now realize that maybe it was worth like going through that car ride to go to the temple. It was the people who are unwilling to access it. It was the people who are extrinsically religious and now found like way more happiness in being more intrinsically religious. Like extrinsic religiosity, just like a random fact from my exam, is like apparently it leads to like more depression and anxiety. Anyway, on the idea of like the idea of opinions, I think it's very interesting that the opposition team didn't consider this one question, which is, when does GPTs give opinions? Because the concept of a GPT itself is the idea of like an objective kind of source, but there is a level of opinions that it has to give. But where does it give opinions? That's the question. We tell you way more reasonably that it's likely to give opinions at the point at which it can maximize access, not at the point at which it can cause extremities and cause people to become radicalized. I think it's far more likely to believe, it's far more likely for you to like kind of agree with the fact that, you know, GPTs are going to give those opinions when they're trying to be moderate. For instance, like if asked about homophobic nature of like certain texts and stuff, it's far more likely to give the opinion that it's like good to treat people equally in order to access increased usage, rather than believing in their claim, which is they're going to give opinions in order to make people extremists. I think that is just a fair enough claim to make, and I think if you believe that, you ought to vote our side, because our side was the only side that kind of was able to tell you that it was more likely to be moderate on both the incentives for people to increase usage, but secondly on the mindset of people to try and make it as objective as possible, because if they didn't do that, then I don't know why they were making it. The point of extremist groups and those Reddit chains and 4chan and all of this stuff is like, that is where the extremist views gets published. It is unable for like a ChatGPT that's extremist to even compete with these, but even if it did, it was unlikely to like exist in the first place, because it was more likely for moderate people to make this. Thank you very much. Oh.
The opposition has left themselves with one path to victory, and it is a path that is blocked by reality. So what is this path? This is the idea that they're simply going to get greater access to religion. They had this in a couple ways. Firstly, they said that they're simply going to get people to understand religion better. They don't get that Google exists, and any other chatbot can do this. You don't actually need a rabbi one to do it for you. But furthermore, this is simply an extraordinarily minor benefit. In terms of people that have access to just like actually like understanding their own faith, we simply think this is such a small marginal benefit. This is for the reason that people with like actual religious communities, as we tell you, it is likely that this actually contradicts with them. For the reason the religious communities are particularly nuanced, and this is one chatbot for the entirety of, say, the Christian faith. So it's likely that it contradicts with it and you are unwilling to use it. So then, as they already conceive themselves, it's likely the only situation where this exists is extraordinarily marginal, and there's people without any church to go to. You only hear that if there was a church, as they tell you, for all the reason they give you, that you like human connection and things like that, you're going to go to the church instead. So it is only people who have no church or anything like that to go to. And for them, we necessarily think we prove to you that it is not beneficial, it is not meaningful connection, for it has a bad quality, for it is far more likely to disagree, and it's far more likely to be radical. It is obviously, as we tell you, far worse than doing it yourself, far worse than the spiritual fulfillment you would gain from actually doing this interpretation yourself. So in this way, this already small group is accessing faith in a particularly bad way to what the comparative would be. But furthermore, we also tell you that even if you believe it would be good, it is likely they can still access this, because as we tell you from second, it is likely they're able to do this. We simply just don't support the rise in popularity of this. We think this is a small group, so it doesn't actually necessitate the rise in popularity for them to have this access. But noting here though, the large majority of the opposition's benefits require far more than just a chatbot. When they talk about community and they talk about charity, that requires having a community and charity, and that requires having a church and a priest. That cannot simply be achieved by having a chatbot. All of the benefits they list for you about having religions all require more than just a chatbot. And when the only place in which that chatbot is necessarily beneficial or has any change is a case in which you don't have these religious, when you don't have a church, then all of their benefits and all of their impacting falls out of the debate. So now, what are our paths to victory? We give you a couple ways. Firstly, we simply say that this is bad quality advice. This is independent of whether or not it is radical, it goes unresponded to. We tell you that they can't comprehend emotions, they don't have empathy, they don't understand your situation as someone that has known you from childhood would, they don't have the nuance of understanding different the different communities and the comparison between them. So ultimately, there is far worse quality in the advice that is bad for people that use it for advice. But furthermore, secondly, we tell you that it is simply far more radical. And this is a particular harm in terms of the fact that radical beliefs and their spread are probably not good. Things like homophobia are probably not the best, going to be honest. So then, ultimately, we tell you that chatbots are made with data that is given by someone, and it's fairly easy to sway them with radical ideas. The opposition's responses here are pretty mitigatory. They simply say that you want to max users. Obviously, though, this isn't a thing about profit. This is an ideological basis. These are religious people. We tell you that from the beginning. So ultimately, it's likely you're going to do this independent of whether or not you're maxing users. But furthermore, you also only need some of them to be radical, and as we tell you, it is very difficult to differentiate between the radical ones and the non-radical ones, so we still achieve this harm to an extent. But furthermore, the opposition claims that it is radical and progressive data sets sort of cancel out. But as we tell you, it is far more likely that it simply just gives you options, like some people believe X and some people believe Y is what you should do. But this means then that it is far more easy, as we tell you, to justify different actions that you want to take. Furthermore, the opposition claim this is a supplement and a replacement. Again, cuts out all of their biggest benefits, because all of their biggest benefits exist when it was only a replacement for anything else. But finally, we give you a completely independent thing that goes unresponded to largely, which is about a set of religious harms. In the fact that you feel that you have transgressed your faith when you find out that chatbot doesn't represent your faith. The opposition's only response here was to say, but the faith is always seen as being interpreted. But obviously, when people subscribe to Vyomen, they see it as an objective truth. So they find out when they go to an actual religious person, they go to an actual priest, that it is actually wrong and it doesn't actually well represent the faith. And at that point, they feel they have transgressed and the harms come. Furthermore, they don't have to interpret the religion themselves, and again, they don't get that spiritual fulfillment. For those reasons, you should support. Thank you.
To find salvation is to find a freedom from nihilism. It is to find an answer for the search to meaning beyond intellectualized and accessible philosophy. Religion offers the opportunity to be free from despair, from engaging within the fundamental design and beauty of life. If we were able to show you at Affirmative that we were able to give some people salvation, we were able to give some people spirituality, that was a delta large enough that we already won this debate. Let's talk about the paths to victories. I think Negative had a very roundabout one, which is to show that, firstly, they need to show you that these were going to be radical. They also had to show you that that radicalism would be acted upon. Then they then had to show you that priests were not going to be radical. Then finally, they had to show you that you wouldn't access both, and you would only exclusively listen to that ChatGPT bot. I think they managed to fail at every single step. Firstly, why was it less likely to be radical? I think the reason why I was less likely to be radical, firstly, mathematically, there is less radical text out there than moderate text. If you need a good ChatGPT, if you need a good AI, you need as much text as possible. We told you this at first, very minor response to this didn't really work out. If you want to have a good ChatGPT, one that you can access and talk to, you need to have one which uses the biggest data set. That data set is likely to be moderate. But then secondly, this happened for the fourth time today. Secondly, and more importantly, right, that radicalism has to be palatable. That is to say, there is a really large logical leap that negative tried to say here. Insofar as to say that I'm on a computer screen and some AI is telling me you should stone a queer person for me to then actually go out and do it. Realize what we told you at third, which I think was particularly debate-winning and seems to have been ignored by reply, which is to say that if I'm offered a choice between two different options, right? One is about the fundamental nature of religion. That is, to be kind to others, to do unto others as others unto you. That is a very palatable message for me to access. That is a message that I'm likely to incorporate into my daily life. That is a message I'm likely to do, even if I wasn't religious, to try and incorporate in the way that I thought about reality. Contrastingly, if I have an AI telling me that I'm Krishna and I ought to go out and stone some people who are non-believers, even if I wasn't radical, obviously law of common sense dictates I shouldn't do that because we've been socialized to probably not engage in violent activity. But secondly, if I was radical, that wouldn't be justification for me to do it because I was likely to be radical from a whole host of other reasons. This was never the tipping point for radicalism. It was the tipping point for easy engagement. Why was this true? Palatability. On that ground alone, if you have common sense, negative has no path to victory. What then did we offer? I think we offered something which had a lot less leaps in logic, something which was a lot easier to understand, which is that, firstly, more people can access religion. Secondly, religion in its palatable format, in the way that people are most likely to access it, is a good thing. Thirdly, overall, that even if you were to see some forms of radicalized problems, you need to present that in such a way that is palatable and made common sense to the average individual. Firstly, why are people more likely to access religion? I think that this was obviously going to be true on our side. We told you a few things here. Firstly, in cases where things such as temples and places of worship were literally too far away for you to access, this was a stand-in. This was something that you could access. Notice how you can't access a pastor 24/7, even though you would like to. Notice the tension here at negative, which is to say that they tell you that, all of these people are going to be using these sorts of GPTs for religious advice, yet at the same time they won't want to because they aren't able to give salvation the way a human will. I think humans remain humans irrespective of what side you believe in this debate. I think humans want to access and gain human touch. Insofar as to say that that exists, it means that, okay, people are likely to access GPT as something that is supplementary. It means they're able to gain access to that as well as religion. Why then was that exclusively good? That was good because A, you got two sides to a story, which meant they were able to engage in debate. We told you this, I think, at second, no response. Secondly, it meant that religion became more accessible. It was easier for the person who was never in religion in the first place to begin. That was a beautiful thing. As long as you have common sense and believe that killing somebody probably wasn't a good thing to do, we've won this debate. I'm incredibly proud to propose. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you all for the debate. I thought it was quite interesting and quite a close debate. General feedback, reasons for the result. Three things general feedback. I think the first thing is to win a debate, you either need to have a big benefit or a big harm. And I think teams need to make sure they really isolate what is their big benefit or the big harm and make more of a big deal out of it in the debate. I think at times it was hard to nail down what exactly is the thing the teams are going to win on in this debate and why are they winning on it. The second thing is I think at times this debate took on some strange burdens, some strange clashes, probably a bit outside the remit of the topic, so trying to make sure you are targeting what exactly is our win strategy to win this debate, make sure it's targeted to the topic itself. And the last thing I think, at times this debate needs to make sure they're spending a bit of time to actually prove, I guess what you describe as hidden premises or level one premises about how you make your argument work. So for things like how people would use this, and if they would use it badly, probably requires proof they would not use a priest instead. Or I had an example prepared for app, but I didn't write it down. But examples are going to be on both teams to make sure you actually are stepping through all the logic to get to the outcome you want. In terms of the debate today, it was quite a close debate, but ultimately awarded it to side negative. Congratulations. In terms of the issues then, I thought there were three issues. The first one I want to start with is whether or not this AI chatbot, religious bot thing would be radical or not. I think the problem with this issue is it is just a factual question, which I don't know the answer to, of who programs it, because that will largely indicate all of what the teams are saying. So ultimately I think this might be annoying because you're on opposite sides now. So much of my app and neg is who's sitting where. So this team over here on side negative, I think probably does just enough more in this issue to provide some degree of reasoning as to why it is likely to look a certain way or be run by a certain group of people than what AF is able to, which is why they're able to get up. So what I think they're able to do here is on a couple of levels. I think the first question here is on the texts, whether they're more radical or they're more moderate texts out there these bots will be using. I think this unfortunately is a question of, as both teams agree, who programs the bot and who gives it what texts. So I think the good actors AF wants to talk about, I think Neg is able to suggest this group is unlikely to be the ones programming chatbots because this is probably I think the I can't think of the word, but just the first reason just being the religions are old and they don't know how to use technology, so it's unlikely to be them. But I think the second and better response is this idea that for people who hold mainstream, moderate, general beliefs, they already have access to all the church and all the normal processes of proselytizing and spreading their message. So there's people who don't have that access point that are likely to be using and co-opting this technology to preach their particular message, to do it anonymously so they don't get caught up in any flack, or to do it in ways that enable them to reach people who they wouldn't ordinarily do, which means it's a lot more likely in that case to be the less good actors that we want. And secondly, they're likely to push more bad texts in there. I think the first reason Neg gives is the idea that the scholarly texts, there's more imperative for the bad views to go out in scholarly texts, because everyone who kind of believes the moderate view don't write texts or papers to believe that their side is true, that they also need to push certain views. Secondly, that the texts themselves are often in a literal sense quite bad, and that if a ChatGPT is just reading a text, like the actual religious text, in a negative way, it's unlikely to have the nuance or updated ability based around the commentary of that. And there's also a significant issue of interpretation. I think the last good reason that Neg gives is that a lot of the people who might be using this for justification are people who are looking to program and feed certain things into the GPT to get the confirmation bias they want about the radical or bad beliefs that they have. AF tries to point out there's a tension between people believing and not believing what this bot says and whether or not it is religiously appropriate. But I think that misses a bit from Neg about the different types of stakeholders we're talking about here. I do think Neg could be a bit clearer on why this group does this and that group does that. But for me, it was enough in the debate to say, well, the type of people who are trying to justify their own radical beliefs are likely to interpret it in this way and use it as a threat, like a justification for their bad actions. The last response we get from AF is this idea that, well, a lot of this stuff of like the stoning examples are so bad against common sense that lots of people just wouldn't do them. I think that probably deals with the most extreme examples. There's probably a lot more up to that extreme level where it could have that bad impact there. So even if it's not extreme, I still think it is possibly likely, it's not likely to be very good in terms of the outcomes or the advice that it gives or controlled that way. The second question, though, then becomes how is it engaged with by users and what is the impact on those individuals, which is where I think is probably the most important part of the debate. This is, I guess, a question of like whether or not it is replaces or it supplements traditional access to religious guidance, your priests, rabbis, religious leaders, culture, community, etc. I think what ends up happening is both sides end up agreeing that for a bunch of reasons, the in-person traditional access to priests and churches or religious institutions, etc., is preferable. Community building, face-to-face, and more connection to God. Just a nicer experience more than anything else, and also a bit of not trusting technology. All probably means that for the majority of people, this is not the access point they use, but is more likely to stay with the community groups. Therefore, it becomes a bit smaller then as to people who otherwise could not access those religious instruments. And I think the AF does some good narrowing down here to talk about like people whose temples are like 40 kilometers away and things like that, and they need access to this. I think the question is whether or not how much we care about these groups. I think AF does enough to intuitively care, like it's bad to not be able to access your religious beliefs. But what Neg is able to do is actually make that less of an issue in the debate, pointing out to all the other ways which individuals can access and are likely to access connection to religion before having to go to the bots themselves. So things like the texts themselves, their family, their friends, the internet. There are a bunch of other ways they can get the non-chat aspect of these religious benefits before having to go to the chat group. So I think that, again, minimizes how big or relevant this actor is who now can't access the institution, can't access like books, text, family, community, and still wants to access that religious benefit then. So when we get to that person then, I think obviously they're at this point small, but I think Neg is also able to identify that it might be bad for them to do it in this way. The first one is the advice they're likely to give because of the nature of the ChatGPT service itself, is probably worse than no advice at all, because it is likely to be done not specific to their particular vision of that religion, given that religions have many different interpretations and sects. But secondly, not specific to them personally, because they haven't had the growing up with them, they don't know them from the community, they can't give them tailored advice then. And the harms then is that the advice that they're likely to be given by this bot is not likely to be very good or accurate to what they want in a religious sense. But B, it might often make them feel bad because they've accessed this from a source that isn't particularly good or religious, as opposed to a more authoritative sense of a priest or the text themselves. So at that point, then the person we left to think about is accessing bad advice in a space that makes them feel bad, which seems like harms enough to sort of say why it would be bad for that individual to use these systems. The last clash then becomes one on the effect on religion. This is where I think AF took on some maybe bigger burdens than needed to in today's debate of trying to fix or solve religion, in terms of like, one, we want to have religion grow and its popularity, but we also want to have religion be more of a moderated force now that ChatGPT or Rabbi GPT or whatever will make it a more moderated force. I think first, I think there are three things that mean this isn't debate winning for AF. The first is that Neg points out it's not entirely clear that religion is somehow under such significant threat that it requires this as the thing to fix it. Secondly, they also point out it's unclear that this is the big tipping point for people getting on board with religion versus all the other ways in which people already access religion, and why those are likely to be preferable. But thirdly, it's unproven, I think, from Neg why this particular system, or this ChatGPT, unproven from AF, why this ChatGPT will have such a huge impact as to moderate the whole of religion versus the hierarchical structures and the old nature of religion, etc., to have that impact that AF wanted to. So I don't think they're able to show that either of these things are likely or as important in the debate, so therefore can't win on those issues. And with those three things combined, is ultimately why side negatives will take the win. Hope that all made sense. Happy to give me feedback, chat anyone if you want to, now, tomorrow morning, whatever. But otherwise, well done today. Best of luck tomorrow. Best of luck for Australs.